Hi everyone, welcome to Mr. Creepiness. I see a lot of you aren't subscribed yet. It's free, and it helps me keep making these stories for you. If you're enjoying the channel, hit subscribe, and let's get started. Last year, for our 2-year anniversary, my boyfriend Josh gave me this high-tech ultrasonic electric toothbrush. He's a total tech junkie, always reading reviews and hunting down the best gadgets for everything. I remember laughing when I opened the box. An electric toothbrush? For an anniversary? He grinned and said, "Hey, oral hygiene is sexy." Typical Josh. It wasn't even a bad gift. This thing had all the bells and whistles, pressure sensors, a timer, different cleaning modes. Honestly, it was kind of fancy for me. I usually just used the cheapest thing I could find at the drugstore. But it worked really well. My teeth felt super clean after the first couple of days. Then, on the third morning, everything went sideways. I woke up late that day, and Josh had already left for work. I shuffled to the bathroom, still half asleep, grabbed the toothbrush, and pressed the power button. The hum started like normal. I was brushing along when I heard this weird clicking noise. Not loud, but sharp enough to make me pause. I pulled the brush out of my mouth, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when it happened. The toothbrush exploded in my hand. I'm not exaggerating. It actually blew apart. Pieces of plastic flew everywhere, one shard slashing across my cheek like a razor. I screamed as this white-hot pain shot through my face. Blood was pouring down onto the sink, and my ears were ringing from the pop. For a second, I just froze, staring at myself in the mirror with this huge, bloody gash running across my face. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the handle, which was still buzzing in my hand, the bristles twitching like a dying insect. I threw it into the sink, and it finally stopped. I grabbed some toilet paper and pressed it against my cheek, but it didn't stop the bleeding. By now, I was in full panic mode. I called Josh, sobbing, barely able to get the words out. Something happened. The toothbrush. It exploded. He freaked out when he heard "exploded." 10 minutes later, he was pounding on the front door. He took one look at my face and turned white. "Oh my God, we're going to the hospital. Now." At the ER, they cleaned the wound and said I'd need stitches. The doctor was this calm, older guy, but even he looked taken aback when I told him what happened. "An exploding toothbrush? I've never heard of that before," he said, shaking his head. Turns out, it wasn't just a simple cut. The explosion had sent tiny shards of plastic deep into my cheek. Some were embedded so far that I had to go into surgery to get them removed. By the time they finished, my face was swollen and covered in bandages. I looked like I'd been in a bar fight. The next few days were hell. I couldn't eat solid food without feeling a tugging pain in my cheek. Josh was beating himself up, saying over and over, "I should have checked it better. I'm so sorry." We started digging online to figure out what went wrong. That's when we found it. A recall notice for the exact model of the toothbrush he'd bought. Apparently, there was a defect in the motor. Under certain conditions, it could overheat and cause the casing to burst. Josh hadn't seen the recall because he'd bought it secondhand from some reseller online. He thought he was getting a great deal. I was furious. Not at Josh, he didn't know. But at the company, at whoever decided it was okay to sell something so dangerous. All I could think about was how much worse it could have been. What if a shard had hit my eye? What if it had happened while I was brushing my teeth and the plastic tore into my gums or throat? It's been almost a year now. The scar on my cheek is faint, but still there. I've mostly moved on, but sometimes when I look in the mirror, I get this sick feeling in my stomach, like I'm reliving the moment all over again. Josh doesn't buy secondhand gadgets anymore. I'm pretty sure he has PTSD from this whole thing. And me? I went back to using my cheap drugstore toothbrush. Nothing fancy. Nothing electric. Just me and some bristles. And that's how it's gonna stay. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Don't cheap out on safety. Sometimes a great deal isn't worth it. Trust me. I'll start by saying this. I never thought something as innocent as a bag of dog food could lead to something so disturbing. Our neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, had always been the friendly type. You know, the kind that wave at you every morning, lend you sugar when you run out, and chat about the weather. They lived right across the street from us, retired, and always fussing over their perfectly trimmed garden. They didn't have kids or pets of their own, so they loved doting on ours, especially Danny, our 4-year-old Labrador. One Saturday morning, they knocked on our door with a shiny, ribbon-tied bag of what looked like high-end dog food. "For Danny," Mrs. Clark said, smiling wide. "He's such a good boy, and we saw this at the store and thought of him. It's for the best dog on the street." Mr. Clark chuckled, and I thanked them, genuinely touched. It's not every day your dog gets a gift like that. Danny loved it. As soon as I poured some into his bowl, his tail wagged like crazy, and he scarfed it down. I remember thinking, wow, this must be the good stuff. But by the second day, something felt off. Danny, who was usually the friendliest dog you'd ever meet, started acting different. He'd growl at random noises, something he never did. He paced around the house, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor nonstop. By the third day, he even snapped at my hand when I tried to pet him. That's when alarm bells started ringing in my head. I thought maybe he'd gotten into something. Labs will eat just about anything if you let them, so I checked the yard, the trash, even behind the couch in case he'd found something to chew on. Nothing. Then it hit me. What if it was the food? I bagged up some of the food and took Danny to the vet the next morning. The waiting room was packed, and Danny was so restless I had to keep a tight grip on his leash. When we finally got in, the vet did a full checkup and ran some tests. When the vet came back with the results, her face was serious. "You said he's been eating a new brand of food?" I nodded. "We found traces of psychotropic substances in his system." I blinked. "Psychotropic? Like drugs?" "Yes," she said. "Something that's affecting his behavior and central nervous system. It's not lethal in the amount he's ingested, but it could be very dangerous if he continues eating it." I was stunned. Who would put something like that in dog food? My first thought was that it was some kind of manufacturing defect, but the vet wasn't so sure. She told me I should report it to the police just in case. By the time I got home, I felt sick. I couldn't stop staring at that bag of food, sitting on the counter like it had nothing to do with any of this. I tried to tell myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe the Clarks didn't know. Maybe they just bought a bad batch. But then I started hearing things. A neighbor down the street mentioned their cat had been acting strangely before running off and not coming back. Another said their dog had been vomiting for days. And then there were the whispers, the rumors about pets being found dead in the area, poisoned by some sick individual who got a kick out of hurting animals. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected. The next day, I called the police. They took the bag of food as evidence and promised to look into it. I didn't think much would come of it, but at least I felt like I was doing something. A week later, I got a call. The officer on the line told me the food tested positive for a mix of sedatives and hallucinogens. My stomach dropped. He also said they were investigating a possible link to the animal deaths in the area. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the way Mrs. Clark had smiled when she handed me that bag, how Mr. Clark had said Danny was the best dog on the street. It was too much of a coincidence. The Clarks moved out not long after. No explanation, no goodbye, just a for sale sign on their lawn and a moving truck in the driveway. The police never found enough evidence to charge anyone, and the case went cold. Danny's back to his old self now, thankfully, but I still can't trust anyone when it comes to him. Every time someone offers him a treat or a pat on the head, I feel that twist in my gut. I don't know what the Clarks' real intentions were, but here's my advice. Always be careful when it comes to your pets. Sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones you shouldn't. I never liked Jeff. I can't put my finger on it exactly, but something about him always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he stood just a little too close when we talked, or how his laugh felt forced, like he was practicing it. My husband Ted, though, he thought Jeff was great. They'd chat over the fence, compare lawn equipment, and share beers while admiring their perfectly manicured yards. Our yard was a bit more of a jungle compared to Jeff's, though. Ted always promised to get around to trimming the overgrown bushes and the uneven patches of grass, but life got in the way. So when Jeff showed up one afternoon holding an electric garden trimmer, saying he'd gotten it as a gift but didn't need it, Ted couldn't have been happier. "This'll make your yard look sharp in no time," Jeff said, his grin stretching just a little too wide. "It's a good brand too, top of the line." I stood there, arms crossed, feeling like this was more than just a friendly gesture. Jeff didn't strike me as the generous type, but Ted waved off my concerns like always. "It's just a trimmer, babe. Don't overthink it." Ted fired it up the next day. I was in the kitchen, watching him through the window as he attacked the weeds by the fence. He looked so proud of himself, grinning ear to ear. The hum of the trimmer buzzed through the air, almost hypnotic, as the blade spun faster than I thought anything should. It all happened so fast. 1 second, Ted was working, and the next, he let out a strangled yell. I whipped my head toward the window and saw him stumble back. The trimmer was still running, dangling from his hand. But the blade? The blade wasn't attached anymore. It had flown off, slamming straight into his thigh like some kind of projectile. For a second, my brain couldn't process it. I thought maybe he dropped something, but then I saw the blood, thick and dark, gushing down his leg. He clutched his thigh, his face pale as a ghost. I sprinted outside, screaming his name. My bare feet slipped in the growing pool of blood, and I almost fell trying to grab him. Ted was mumbling something, his voice faint, but I couldn't understand him. The trimmer was lying in the grass, its motor still whirring like it didn't just destroy my entire world. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, and called 911. "My husband, he's bleeding out. Please, please hurry." I sobbed into the phone. They told me to put pressure on the wound. I tore off my sweater and pressed it against his leg as hard as I could, but the blood wouldn't stop. It just kept coming. Ted's lips were turning blue, his eyes glassy. I screamed at him to stay with me, but deep down I knew. He was slipping away. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Ted was gone. The paramedics tried to be kind, but their faces told me everything. The police came next, asking questions I could barely comprehend. I sat on the porch in a daze, staring at the blood-soaked grass. My husband had been alive and laughing less than an hour ago, and now he was gone. The trimmer was taken for testing. A few days later, an investigator called me with the results. It was a factory defect, they said, like that was supposed to make me feel better. The blade wasn't secured properly, and at high speeds, it became a projectile. It's extremely rare. I didn't care about the statistics. All I could think about was Jeff. When I told him what happened, his reaction felt wrong. There was no shock, no real sadness, just a vague, "That's terrible, I'm so sorry." And then after an awkward pause, he said, "At least it wasn't me, right?" What kind of person says something like that? I started digging into Jeff's past. It took weeks of combing through local records and asking around, but eventually I found something chilling. 10 years ago, Jeff's wife had died in a freak accident. She fell from a ladder while cleaning the gutters, cracking her skull. Jeff told everyone it was a tragedy, but neighbors hinted at arguments leading up to her death. Nothing was ever proven, but the whispers never went away. I can't shake the feeling that Jeff knew the trimmer was defective. Maybe he didn't tamper with it himself, but he gave it to Ted knowing it could be dangerous. Or maybe I'm just looking for someone to blame because the truth is too painful to face. All I know is that Ted is gone, and Jeff still waves at me from across the street like nothing ever happened. I keep the blinds closed now. I still think about Nate's birthday sometimes, and every time, I get this tight knot in my chest. It started as the perfect day. My wife and I had been planning the gift for weeks, an electric skateboard. Nate had been talking about it nonstop, sending us YouTube links, circling ads and catalogs, and even leaving sticky notes on our fridge. The look on his face when he unwrapped it was worth every penny. He immediately took it outside, still in his pajamas, to test it out. His laughter echoed through the yard, and we all felt this rush of pride. That skateboard seemed to be the ticket to his happiest birthday ever. The trouble started on the second ride. After lunch, Nate wanted to show off his new toy to his friends, so we walked with him to the park. It was one of those sunny afternoons that felt like it could stretch forever. His friends took turns trying the skateboard while we kept a watchful eye. Everything seemed fine. Nate was grinning ear to ear, even after wiping out once or twice while getting the hang of the controls. But then, during one of Nate's runs, I noticed something odd. A faint, burnt plastic smell wafted in the air. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the motor warming up. He'd been riding it for a good half hour, so I figured it was normal wear and tear. The sound changed first. The hum of the motor grew louder, like a buzzsaw, and then it cut out completely. Nate was going downhill when it happened, and the skateboard stopped dead under him. He didn't even have time to react. One moment, he was cruising. The next, he was airborne. He hit the asphalt with a sickening crunch. I ran faster than I thought I could. My wife screamed his name as she sprinted behind me. Nate was lying on his side, groaning, one arm twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. His face was scraped raw on one side, a red smear standing out against the gray pavement. His friends froze, horrified. I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. My wife knelt beside Nate, cradling his head, whispering over and over, "It's okay, baby. We're here." But I could see it in her eyes. She was terrified too. The paramedics arrived quickly, but those few minutes felt like an eternity. They splinted his arm and cleaned the blood off his face before loading him into the ambulance. One of them mentioned how lucky he was to have been wearing a helmet. "Could have been a lot worse," he said. Worse? The word rattled in my head like a broken echo. At the hospital, the x-rays showed 2 clean breaks in his forearms. He'd need surgery for one of them. The scrape on his face was deeper than it looked, and they had to stitch it up. I couldn't stop staring at the thread zigzagging across his cheek. The doctor said the scar might fade with time, but there were no guarantees. The guilt hit me hard. We had bought him the skateboard without researching it. It was some off-brand model we'd found on sale. We figured a skateboard was a skateboard. What could go wrong? That night, after Nate was settled in his hospital bed, I searched online for reviews. My stomach sank as I scrolled through complaint after complaint about overheating batteries, sudden motor failures, and even a recall notice buried on the manufacturer's website. How could we have missed this? Over the next few weeks, we tried to put the incident behind us. Nate was a trooper through recovery, even joking about how his casts made him look like a robot. But I could tell he was self-conscious about the scar. He'd stopped FaceTiming his friends as much, and turned away whenever we tried to take pictures. Then one evening, while I was putting away laundry, I found the skateboard shoved in the back of Nate's closet. It still had flecks of dried blood on the grip tape. My chest tightened as I carried it to the garage. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out just yet, so I leaned it against the wall, out of sight. A month later, we got an email from the company officially recalling the product. They offered refunds and even a vague apology. "We regret any inconvenience caused," it read. Inconvenience. Like what happened to Nate was a scheduling conflict or a minor mishap. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can never be too careful with what you bring into your home. Something as innocent as a gift can have consequences you never see coming. Every time I see an ad for electric skateboards now, I feel a chill run through me. It could have been worse, but it could have been so much better. It started with what seemed like a thoughtful gift. A family friend, Tom, had a boat motor he didn't need anymore. He was upgrading, he said, and thought we could use it. We'd been talking for months about replacing our old motor, so it felt like perfect timing. My dad was ecstatic. He loved spending weekends on the lake, and this felt like a good excuse to get back out there. We installed the motor together on a Saturday morning, the sun already climbing high. Dad whistled the entire time, proud of the way everything fit so perfectly. almost like the boat was meant for this motor. Tom even came by to help. He gave Dad a firm pat on the back before leaving, saying something like, "This'll make a difference, you'll see." The first few hours were great. The motor purred smoothly as we zipped across the lake, the cool spray hitting my face. It was just me and Dad, like old times before things got busy. But halfway across the lake, things started to feel off. The motor, which had been so quiet, sputtered. At first, Dad thought it was low on fuel, but when he checked, the tank was fine. That's when the smoke started. It was a small curl at first, rising from the base of the motor. I pointed it out, and Dad's face turned serious. "Probably just oil burning off," he muttered, though his voice wavered. He shut off the motor to check, but as soon as it stopped, the smoke thickened. Within seconds, it turned black and acrid, filling the air around us. "Get the extinguisher," Dad yelled, his calm demeanor cracking. I scrambled to the small storage compartment where we kept it. But by the time I found it, flames were already licking up the side of the motor. The extinguisher worked, briefly. It sputtered out too quickly, and the fire roared back twice as strong. I remember Dad yelling at me to grab the oars, but it was like my hands stopped working. The boat was tilting now, the flames spreading across the wooden deck, eating through layers like paper. "Jump, Alex!" Dad's voice was sharp, panicked in a way I'd never heard before. He was pointing at the water, his face glowing in the firelight. I didn't think. I just jumped. The cold water hit me like a slap, shocking the breath out of my lungs. When I surfaced, coughing and gasping, I saw Dad still on the boat, trying to grab something. Maybe his tool bag, maybe the emergency radio. The flames were all around him now. "Dad!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the chaos. "Get out!" He hesitated. Then he jumped. The lake swallowed him immediately. I treaded water, frantically scanning the surface, expecting him to pop up any second. But he didn't. The thing about my dad is he couldn't swim. He'd always stayed in the shallow parts of the lake, letting the boat do the work. I dove down, my arms flailing in the dark, trying to find him. My lungs burned as I resurfaced, only to dive again. Each time, I came up alone. By the time help arrived, other boaters who saw the smoke, it was too late. They pulled me onto their boat, but all I could do was point and scream, "He's still in there, you have to find him!" Hours later, divers found his body near the wreckage of the boat. He'd gone down fast, weighed down by the heavy boots he always wore. The fire was ruled an accident, caused by a defect in the motor. Apparently, Tom knew about it. He'd tried to fix it himself instead of having it professionally repaired. When it didn't work, he passed it off to us, probably thinking it'd be fine. He never said a word about the defect. The investigation dragged on for weeks, and Tom stopped coming around. When he was questioned, he claimed he had no idea the motor was unsafe. But he must have known. There was evidence of tampering, hastily replaced screws, a patch job on the fuel line. It was enough to clear him of intentional harm, but not enough to clear my mind. I can't go near water now. The smell of burning wood makes my stomach turn. Sometimes I dream about Dad, stuck on that burning boat, calling for help I couldn't give. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never accept a gift without knowing where it came from. When we first moved into the house, it felt like a dream come true. Big backyard, quiet neighborhood, a place to finally call our own. It was a fresh start. A few days after the move, Mark, an old friend of John's, stopped by to welcome us to the neighborhood with a massive rolled-up rug. "Thought this might fit perfectly in your living room," he said, dropping it just inside the front door. The rug was beautiful, Persian style, with intricate patterns. I didn't think much of the fact that it was a little musty. Mark was the kind of guy who held on to things forever. He was quirky, but he meant well, and John seemed genuinely happy to see him. That night, we unrolled the rug. It was heavy, but it really did tie the room together. I vacuumed it twice just in case, and we admired how cozy it made the space feel. A couple of days later, I started noticing something odd. My arms were itching. At first, I thought it was just from cleaning all the dust from the move, but the itching didn't stop. By the next morning, I had red patches on my skin. Maybe it's a heat rash, John suggested, though he was scratching at his neck too. He brushed it off, but I couldn't ignore the discomfort. The itching got worse. John and I were scratching constantly, arms, legs, even our backs. We checked the bed, thinking maybe we'd brought bedbugs with us during the move, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That's when I remembered the rug. It seemed far-fetched, but I decided to inspect it closely. Pulling up a corner, I noticed tiny white specks embedded in the fibers. Larvae. The realization made my stomach drop. I freaked out. We rolled the rug up immediately and hauled it into the garage. I wanted to throw it away, but John insisted we get it cleaned first. He didn't want to offend Mark. The itching didn't stop. By the next day, I was coughing too. John started wheezing at night, and his skin rash had turned into swollen, red patches. We went to a doctor, who told us we'd likely been exposed to mold spores. Toxic ones. "We don't have mold," I said, confused. Then it hit me, the rug. An exterminator confirmed our worst fears. The rug had been infested with both mold and insect larvae, which had started spreading through the house. It wasn't just in the living room anymore, it had traveled into the carpet in the bedroom, the couch, even the air vents. John's reaction got so bad that he had to be hospitalized. His throat swelled up, and he could barely breathe. Sitting in the hospital waiting room, I felt a creeping dread I couldn't shake. Why had Mark given us that rug? He'd seemed so casual about it, but now I was wondering if he'd even cleaned it before bringing it over. When I called Mark to ask where the rug came from, he hesitated. I don't know. It was just something I had lying around," he said. But his voice sounded off, too casual, like he was hiding something. I did some digging. Mark wasn't just an old friend. He and John had a falling out years ago over money. Mark had lent John some cash, and John hadn't paid him back for months. They'd patched things up eventually, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's gift wasn't as innocent as it seemed. I confronted John about it when he got home from the hospital. He shrugged it off, but his expression told me he was thinking the same thing. "We can't prove anything," he said finally. He was right, but that didn't make it any easier to sleep at night. I threw the rug out, deep cleaned every inch of the house, and spent a fortune on pest control. Even so, the itching didn't stop for weeks. I still wake up sometimes scratching at nothing, convinced I can feel bugs crawling on me. Mark hasn't visited since. I haven't reached out to him, and neither has John. I don't know if it was intentional or if he was just careless, but I can't bring myself to trust him again. Every time I see a housewarming gift now, I feel a pang of anxiety. Be careful what you bring into your home. You never know what kind of damage it might do or where it really came from. That rug? It wasn't just a gift, it was a warning. Here's my story, and yeah, I'm still trying to piece it all together. For our 5th anniversary, Linda handed me this envelope with a sly grin. Inside was a certificate for a tandem skydiving experience. She knew I'd always wanted to do it. It was one of those bucket list things I'd never gotten around to. I hugged her, barely able to contain my excitement. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate, something thrilling we'd remember forever. The jump was booked for a Saturday, and I spent the week reading everything I could about skydiving. By the time we got to the airfield, I was more pumped than nervous. Linda decided she'd watch from the ground. She wasn't a fan of heights, but she wanted me to have the full experience. The day was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the faint smell of jet fuel in the air. The instructors were laid back, joking around as they explained the gear. I was fitted with a harness, shown how to pull the main cord, and told there was a backup reserve chute in case something went wrong. Their confidence rubbed off on me. I didn't even think about things going wrong. The plane was loud and cramped, but I loved every second of it. As we climbed higher, I started feeling the adrenaline kick in. When we hit altitude, the door slid open, and the rush of cold air hit me like a slap. One by one, people jumped. My tandem instructor clipped onto my harness, gave me a thumbs up, and we shuffled to the edge. The free fall was everything I imagined. terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The ground rushed up, and I felt like I was flying. At the right altitude, I reached for the cord. I pulled. Nothing happened. For a split second, I thought it was normal. Maybe there was a delay. Then the panic hit. I yelled to my instructor, but I could barely hear myself over the wind. He reached around and pulled the reserve cord. I waited for the jolt of the chute opening. Still nothing. I twisted my head back and saw him frantically tugging at something. It was stuck. I'd read about this, how unlikely it was for both chutes to fail. The odds were astronomical. And yet, here I was, falling faster than I'd ever imagined possible, and no one could save me. My brain was screaming, "This is it. This is how it ends." The ground was getting closer. Too close. My instructor was yelling something, but it was just noise. I clenched my teeth and closed my eyes. I don't know what I thought was going to happen. Maybe that I'd pass out or something would magically fix itself. But nothing did. We hit. I don't remember the impact. Just a blinding flash of pain and then darkness. When I came to, I was lying in a field, my body twisted in ways that didn't seem right. I couldn't feel my legs. My instructor was next to me, yelling into a radio. Linda's face floated into my mind, and I remember thinking, I'm never going to see her again. The paramedics came fast. I could hear the whir of a helicopter. They stabilized me and loaded me up. The pain was unreal, but I clung to consciousness, trying to stay awake. In the hospital, I found out I'd shattered both legs and fractured my spine. The doctors said it was a miracle I survived at all. Most people don't walk away from something like that, literally or figuratively. Here's the kicker. When we investigated, the company admitted their equipment was faulty. The main chute had been improperly packed, and the reserve cord was frayed. They knew. They knew their gear wasn't safe and sent me up anyway. A few months later, I found out they'd been cutting corners to save money. I've been through surgeries, physical therapy, and endless nights replaying those moments in my head. The company eventually settled out of court, but no amount of money will erase what happened. I can't skydive again. Hell, I can barely walk some days. And Linda? She's been my rock, but I know she blames herself for giving me that certificate. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that trust is a fragile thing. I trusted those people with my life, and they treated it like it didn't matter. So if you're ever thinking about doing something thrilling, do your homework. Double-check everything. Because sometimes one little oversight is all it takes to ruin everything. Stay safe out there. I don't know why I'm writing this, but maybe someone else needs to hear it. Maybe it'll stop someone from making the same mistake we did. It started off so normal. Our son Ben had his 8th birthday last month. We threw him a small party, just some neighbors and a few of his classmates. One of the neighbors, this guy Steve who lives 3 doors down, showed up with a gift for Ben. It was a bright red remote-controlled car with oversized wheels and flashy decals. Ben's face lit up. "Wow, thanks, Mr. Steve," he said, hugging the box. Steve just gave him this weird smile. Kind of forced, like he wasn't sure what to do with a kid's gratitude. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ben spent the rest of the evening racing that car up and down the driveway. The thing zipped around like a little rocket, and every time it hit a bump, it flipped and kept going. He was obsessed. A few days later, Ben wanted to take the car to school for show and tell. I hesitated. The school had a rule against toys, but he begged. "Please, Mom, I want everyone to see it." Eventually, I caved. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? That morning, I watched him proudly carry the car into class, his little chest puffed out with excitement. I got a call around noon. It was the school nurse, her voice tight and professional. "Mrs. Turner, there's been an incident with Ben. He's okay, but we need you to come to the school immediately." My stomach dropped. She wouldn't tell me anything else, just that he was in her office. When I got there, Ben was sitting on a cot, his face pale and his hands wrapped in layers of gauze. The smell hit me before I saw him, burnt plastic and something chemical, acrid. I wanted to throw up. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. The nurse gestured to the charred remains of the remote-controlled car on her desk. He was showing the car to his classmates when it started to smoke. He tried to turn it off, but it exploded in his hands. Exploded. My mind was racing. "How bad is it?" I asked. She sighed. "The burns are second degree. He'll need treatment, but he should recover fully. It could have been a lot worse." Ben was silent the whole ride home, staring out the window, his bandaged hands resting in his lap. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, my heart breaking. When we got home, I went straight to Steve's house. I wasn't even thinking, just acting on pure adrenaline and anger. He opened the door, and I shoved the box at him, what was left of it anyway. "Did you know this thing was dangerous?" I snapped. Steve's eyes went wide. Whoa, what's going on?" I told him what happened, and his expression shifted. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "I didn't know, I swear. I bought it on clearance at some pop-up shop downtown. That set me off." "You didn't check if it was safe? You gave my son a ticking time bomb." He mumbled something about it being just a toy, and how he couldn't have known. I stormed off before I did something I'd regret. Later that night, I started digging. I found the brand name on a melted piece of the car and looked it up. Turns out the toy had been recalled months ago for faulty batteries. Several other incidents had been reported: overheating, smoke, minor burns. But nothing like what happened to Ben. It was horrifying to think about how easily we could have avoided this. A quick online search, a little due diligence. For weeks, Ben had to live with his hands wrapped up. He couldn't hold a pencil or feed himself without help. He cried a lot, mostly out of frustration. Watching your kids struggle like that is a special kind of hell. Steve came by once to apologize, but I couldn't even look at him. All I could think about was how careless he'd been. Looking back, I keep wondering, why didn't I check the toy myself? Why did I trust a neighbor I barely knew? We all get so comfortable, assuming the world around us is safe. It's not. Ben's hands are healing now, but I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, or Steve. Every time I see a remote-controlled car, I feel this wave of panic. So, here's my cautionary tale. If someone gives your kid a gift, check it out. Read the labels. Look it up. It might feel paranoid, but trust me, it's worth it. You don't want to learn this lesson the hard way. It started with what seemed like a thoughtful gesture. My new neighbors, Matt and Karen, had only moved in a few weeks ago, and they were super friendly. The kind of people who always had a smile ready and asked about your day like they actually cared. When they found out I liked to barbecue, they showed up on my porch with this sleek stainless steel barbecue set. The tools looked expensive: polished metal, solid wood handles, and the grill was compact but stylish, perfect for my small backyard. "Figured you'd put this to good use," Matt said with a grin, handing over the set. "We had an extra one." Karen stood behind him, smiling just a little too wide. I thanked them, of course. Who wouldn't? I told them I'd try it out that weekend and joked about inviting them over. But Karen quickly said, "Oh no, we're busy, just enjoy." That should have been my first clue. Saturday rolled around, and I invited a few friends over to break in the new gear. The grill was smaller than what I was used to, but it seemed sturdy enough. I lit the coals, let them heat up, and everything seemed fine. I was skewering some veggies when one of my friends, Sam, said, "This thing's kind of flimsy, huh?" I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He tapped the edge of the grill's lid, and it rattled more than it should have. "Just saying, it looks nice, but it feels off." I shrugged it off. I mean, it was a gift. They wouldn't give me something unsafe, right? About 20 minutes in, I went to flip the burgers. That's when it happened. The whole grill collapsed. Not just tipped over. Collapsed. The metal legs bent inward like they'd been made of tin foil, and the grate fell straight down. The hot coals spilled everywhere, and one of them landed right on my foot. I froze for a split second, feeling a sharp, searing pain. Then I screamed. I couldn't help it. The heat shot through my foot like nothing I'd ever felt before. Shit, 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 Sam yelled, grabbing a bottle of water and dumping it over my foot. It didn't help much. Someone else grabbed ice from the cooler, but by then the damage was done. My foot was a mess. Red, blistering, and swollen within minutes. Another friend drove me to the hospital while I bit down on a towel to stop from yelling the whole way there. The doctor told me I had second-degree burns and would need weeks of treatment. Back at home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how the grill had fallen apart. I kept picturing the legs folding under the weight, the way the coals spilled so easily. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I decided to take a closer look. My foot was wrapped up, so I hobbled out to the backyard on crutches. The grill was still there, tipped on its side, the coals long since burned out. When I inspected the legs, I noticed something strange. The metal wasn't bent, it was cut. Tiny, deliberate cuts near the joints, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. It wasn't wear and tear, it was sabotage. Someone had made sure that grill wouldn't hold up under heat. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Why would Matt and Karen give me a defective grill? Did they know it was like this? Did they make it like this? The next day I decided to confront them. I limped over to their house, still shaky on crutches, and knocked on the door. Matt answered with his usual smile, but it faltered when he saw me. "Hey, you okay?" "No," I said flatly. "The grill you gave me, it collapsed. I got second-degree burns, and it looks like the legs were cut." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he laughed, but it was forced, awkward. "Oh, come on. Why would we do something like that? Maybe it was just cheap metal. We didn't know." Karen appeared behind him, her face pale. "We just thought you'd like it," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "We didn't mean anything." I didn't believe them, but what could I do? Accuse them of trying to hurt me? I didn't have proof. After that, things got weird. They stopped waving when they saw me. If I came outside, they went back in. One night, I saw Matt standing in his backyard, just staring at my house. He didn't move for almost 5 minutes. Then there were the small things. Packages left on my porch with no return address. Strange knocks on my door late at night. A car I didn't recognize parked across the street for hours. I started locking my doors and double-checking my windows. But the anxiety ate at me. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound. One night, I got up around 2 a.m. to get some water, and I saw them, Matt and Karen, standing at the edge of my yard, watching. I don't live there anymore. The burns healed, but the paranoia didn't. I can't prove they meant to hurt me, but I know what I saw. If your neighbors seem too nice, maybe think twice before accepting a gift. You never know what strings might be attached. For my 30th birthday, my colleague Jim gave me a drone. It wasn't just any drone. It was sleek, compact, and came with a high-definition camera. Jim handed it to me with a grin and said, "Saw you eyeing these online. Figured you'd love it." And I did. I'd been saving up for one, but life kept getting in the way. This was the perfect gift. The drone came in a box with instructions written in some barely decipherable English. I didn't think much of it. Lots of gadgets are like that. Jim mentioned he'd snagged it off some site during a flash sale. "Way cheaper than the usual stuff," he said. I wasn't going to complain. Free is free. The next day, I decided to test it out. My backyard was perfect, wide open, no tall trees, just some fencing separating the properties. It took a while to figure out the controls, but once I got the hang of it, it was incredible. The thing zipped around like a bird, capturing sharp footage of the neighborhood. I felt like a kid again, laughing as I made it do flips and loops. Then, the drone started acting strange. It wouldn't respond properly to my controls. At first, I thought it was just user error. I'm no expert. But the drone jerked mid-air, veering in odd directions. I tried to steady it, but it had a mind of its own. Before I could hit the emergency shutdown button, it shot off, over my fence, toward my neighbor's yard. My heart dropped. I could hear the drone's buzzing fade as I scrambled over the fence. My neighbors were out with their 2 kids, The older one was chasing a ball, and the younger boy, barely 2, was toddling around near his mom. The drone came out of nowhere. It happened so fast. 1 second, the toddler was giggling, reaching for a flower. The next, the drone clipped his head with its sharp, spinning blades. Blood sprayed onto the grass. His mom screamed, scooping him up. The drone crashed into the ground a few feet away, its whirring finally silenced. I froze, paralyzed by the horror unfolding in front of me. My neighbor's husband bolted out of the house and carried the boy to their car. His tiny body was limp, his face pale. They sped off to the hospital while I stood there, my hands shaking. I couldn't even apologize. I couldn't find the words. That night, I couldn't sleep. My phone sat on the table, vibrating every few minutes with updates from Jim and other friends. I couldn't bring myself to read them. Hours later, I got the message I'd been dreading. The boy didn't make it. I can't describe the guilt that hit me like a truck. I kept replaying the scene in my head. What if I hadn't flown the drone that day? What if I'd been quicker to shut it down? I called Jim, desperate for answers about where he'd gotten it. He sounded panicked. I didn't know this would happen, he stammered. I bought it off some site. It looked legit. Just had a crazy discount. What site? I demanded. He sent me the link. It was a shady, no-name store full of flashy ads and broken English. A quick search confirmed my worst fears. They sold counterfeit electronics, and drones with faulty programming were a common complaint. People reported crashes, loss of control, even fires. I reported the incident to the authorities, giving them everything I knew about the site and the drone. Jim was interrogated too, though I don't think he truly understood the gravity of what he'd done. He just kept apologizing, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered. A child was dead because of a gift. The investigation dragged on for weeks. I was questioned repeatedly, had to relive every moment. My neighbors didn't speak to me, not that I blamed them. Their yard stayed empty. No more giggles, no more toys scattered in the grass. Just silence. I got rid of the drone. I couldn't stand looking at it. But even now, every time I hear a buzzing noise, a fly, a lawnmower, it's like I'm back there, watching the blood hit the ground. I can't stop seeing the mother's face, twisted in anguish, or hearing her screams echo in my head. People think gifts are just thoughtful gestures, harmless tokens of affection. But this one destroyed lives. And the worst part? It wasn't malice. It wasn't intentional. It was carelessness. A thoughtless purchase from a sketchy site, handed off with good intentions. If you're reading this, let this be a warning. Be careful about the things you bring into people's lives. A cheap thrill, a careless decision. It can shatter everything. I'll never forget that day, and I'll never forgive myself. I never thought my birthday at work would turn into one of the most unsettling days of my life. It was a typical office gathering, the kind where people slap on half-hearted smiles, eat cheap snacks, and make awkward small talk. This time, though, my colleague Steve decided to go all out and brought a homemade cake. "Baked it myself," he said, grinning like he was proud of himself. Honestly, it was hard to believe. Steve was the kind of guy who joked about living on energy drinks and takeout because cooking was a waste of time. Still, the cake looked great, perfectly frosted with some fancy piping on the edges. A couple of us even clapped, half joking. "Wow, Steve, maybe there's more to you than spreadsheets and bad coffee," someone teased. I was already on edge that day. Call it intuition, or just the weight of a weird vibe I couldn't shake. But something about Steve had felt off lately. He'd been more withdrawn than usual, his jokes less funny, his eyes darting like he was scanning the room for something. But hey, we all have bad weeks, right? The first bite of the cake tasted fine. Sweet, rich chocolate. Everyone seemed impressed, and Steve looked genuinely pleased with himself. A few of my coworkers even asked for seconds. It felt like a normal celebration, but not for long. About 10 minutes after my second slice, one of my coworkers, Sarah, muttered, "Does anyone else taste something weird?" I didn't at first, but then it hit me. A faint bitterness at the back of my tongue, like I'd chewed an aspirin. I figured it was just an ingredient Steve messed up. Baking's tricky, right? Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the taste. My stomach felt unsettled, not from nausea, but from a creeping discomfort, like my body was trying to tell me something my brain hadn't caught up to yet. When the party wound down, I went to toss some of the leftover cake into the trash. That's when I saw it, a tiny white object lodged in a piece of the frosting. I almost thought it was a chunk of sugar or a sprinkle, but when I picked it out, my stomach sank. It wasn't sugar. It was a pill. It looked intact, almost like it had been placed there after the cake was baked. My heart raced as I stared at it, turning it over in my fingers. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't something that accidentally ended up in a dessert. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe Steve just dropped something while baking. But the pit in my stomach kept growing. I wrapped the pill in a napkin and pocketed it before anyone else could notice. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The more I thought about Steve, the stranger his behavior seemed. How he'd stood in the corner of the room, watching everyone eat with a nervous smile. How he barely touched a slice himself. The next morning, I took the pill to a pharmacy and asked if they could tell me what it was. The pharmacist gave me a strange look before answering. "This is a prescription sedative," she said. "Really strong. You don't just get this over the counter." My hands started shaking. I thanked her and left, my mind spinning. Why the hell would a sedative be in a cake? Back at work, I decided to confront Steve. But he wasn't there. I waited all morning, but no one had seen him. Finally, I texted him, trying to keep it casual. "Hey, thanks for the cake yesterday. Quick question, did you, drop something in it by accident?" No response. Later, HR sent out an email. Steve had resigned. No explanation, just a generic message about personal reasons. I told a close coworker about the pill. Her face went pale and she whispered, "You don't think he was trying to..." She didn't finish, but we both knew what she meant. The police got involved after I anonymously tipped them off. They wanted to see the pill, so I handed it over. Turns out Steve had a record, a quiet one, buried deep. But it was there. Past charges of spiking drinks, though none had stuck. Steve vanished after that. Quit his job, left his apartment, and seemingly disappeared into thin air. Every now and then, I still think about him. About what could have happened if I hadn't found that pill. About how easily trust can be misplaced. I haven't celebrated a birthday at work since, and if anyone ever offers me homemade anything, I politely decline. Sometimes, it's the people you least expect who are capable of the most horrifying things. Last Christmas, my brother Jake handed me a box wrapped in gold paper. He looked proud, like he'd found something perfect. When I unwrapped it, it was a set of electric string lights, the kind you hang in a window to make everything feel a little more magical. Jake wasn't usually thoughtful with gifts, so I made a big deal of it. "Thanks, man. This is great." He shrugged it off. "Thought the kids would like them. They blink and everything." That night, my wife Ellie and I strung them up in the living room window. The soft glow reflected off the snow outside. Our daughters, Lily and Maggie, loved them. Lily, our 5-year-old, kept running over to watch the lights blink. "They're perfect," Ellie said, giving me a small smile. For the first time in weeks, everything felt calm. No fights about money, no chaos of the kids wrecking the house, just a nice, quiet evening with those lights twinkling in the corner. I remember waking up around 2 a.m. that night, the way you do when something's not quite right. At first, it was just a faint smell, like something burning, but not quite. I thought maybe Ellie had left a candle burning downstairs, so I rolled over and ignored it. But then it hit me. The smell was stronger, and there was this weird heat in the air. I shook Ellie awake. "Do you smell that?" She sniffed, and her face turned pale. "Oh my God." We both bolted out of bed. I ran to the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The glow wasn't just from the string lights anymore. There was an orange flicker crawling along the edge of the living room doorway. Smoke billowed up the stairs. "Ellie, get the kids!" I yelled, my voice cracking. She darted to Maggie's room, and I went for Lily. By the time I opened her door, the smoke was thick. I grabbed her and ran down the stairs, coughing, eyes watering. Ellie was already outside with Maggie, screaming for me to hurry. When I stepped onto the lawn, the cold air felt like a slap. My heart was pounding, but I was alive. Lily was sobbing into my chest, her little arms wrapped around my neck, and then Ellie screamed, louder than I've ever heard in my life. "Where's Maggie?" I froze. She pointed to Lily in my arms. "That's Lily. Where's Maggie?" My stomach dropped. It was like the world slowed down, and all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and Ellie screaming. I turned back to the house. Flames were shooting out of the windows now, the whole living room engulfed. Maggie's room was on the first floor, just off the kitchen. I don't remember making the decision to run back in. I just did. The heat hit me like a wall the second I opened the door. The smoke was so thick I couldn't see more than a foot in front of me. I crawled, trying to stay low, calling out Maggie's name. I don't know how long I was in there. 10 seconds? 20? I remember coughing so hard I thought I'd pass out. The heat was unbearable, my hands burning every time I touched the floor. I couldn't see anything. Couldn't find her. And then Ellie was pulling me back outside. "You can't! You'll die!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The fire department showed up 10 minutes later, but by then, it was too late. They found Maggie in her bed. She never woke up. The next few days were a blur. People brought casseroles, neighbors hugged us, but none of it mattered. Nothing could touch the emptiness. The investigation didn't take long. The fire marshal said it started in the living room, specifically at the outlet where we'd plugged in the string lights. The wiring inside them had overheated. They were cheap, poorly made. I couldn't even be angry at Jake. He didn't know. He just wanted to give us something nice. It's been almost a year now, and I still see those lights in my head. Every time I close my eyes, they're there, blinking away like nothing's wrong. If you're reading this, check your decorations. Check the cords, the plugs, the labels. If it seems cheap, it probably is. I wish I'd thought about that before. But mostly, I just wish I could hold Maggie one more time. So, this happened about 3 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. My son Danny was in 2nd grade. Sweet kid, a little hyper at times, but what 7-year-old isn't? Anyway, one day he came home from school all excited. His teacher, Mr. Peterson, had handed out these special prizes to the kids who behaved well that week. Danny got a set of stationery, fancy stuff too. Ruler, scissors, pencils, erasers, all packed neatly in a shiny box. He was so proud of it. "Look, Mom, Mr. Peterson said I've been doing great in class," he beamed. I remember smiling and ruffling his hair. It was nice seeing him so excited about school. At first, it seemed like nothing. Danny opened the box and started using the supplies for his homework. Everything looked perfectly normal. But then, 2 days later, he came to me, holding his hand. "Mom, I cut myself on the ruler," he said, wincing. It was a small cut, but it looked deeper than you'd expect from a plastic ruler. "Be more careful, honey," I said, cleaning the wound. I didn't think much of it at the time, but by the next morning, his hand was swollen. The cut was red, almost black around the edges, and he had a slight fever. We rushed him to the ER. The doctor examined his hand, asked a few questions, and then ran some tests. That's when things started getting really strange. They found traces of some chemical, something toxic, in his blood. The doctor asked if Danny had come into contact with anything unusual. I mentioned the ruler. The doctor frowned. "Bring it in. We'll test it." I felt a chill then, like a weight settling in my chest. What could possibly be on a ruler to cause this? I went home, grabbed the stationery box, and brought it back to the hospital. A few hours later, the tests came back. The ruler, and apparently the scissors too, had traces of some industrial solvent on them. Stuff that shouldn't be anywhere near kids. By this point, Danny was stable but needed antibiotics and a minor procedure to clean out the infection. My husband and I were furious. We went straight to the school to demand answers. That's when we found out Danny wasn't the only one. 3 other kids had similar injuries, cuts, infections, weird skin reactions. All of them had used the same stationery sets, all given by Mr. Peterson. The school administration looked as shocked as we were. They immediately pulled Mr. Peterson aside for questioning. I remember seeing him in the hallway, arms crossed, his face calm. Too calm. Like none of this surprised him. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The police got involved, and after searching his home, they found evidence. Apparently, Mr. Peterson had some warped sense of discipline. He believed certain kids, ones he labeled as troublemakers, needed to learn consequences. He had tampered with the stationery sets, mixing in chemicals to teach them a lesson if they weren't careful. He didn't see it as abuse. He thought he was helping them build character or some twisted logic like that. I still remember sitting in the courtroom months later, listening to the prosecutor lay it all out. Mr. Peterson showed no remorse. He just sat there, blank-faced, while the parents of those kids, myself included, poured out our anger and fear. Danny recovered physically, but it took a long time for him to trust adults again. He started hesitating with gifts, even from family. "Is it safe, Mom?" he'd ask every time, and it broke my heart. I still wonder if there were signs we missed. Mr. Peterson had always been strict, but he seemed fair enough at first glance. Who would have thought he'd go this far? Now, every time I see something as innocent as a box of pencils or a ruler, I can't help but double-check. It's crazy how something so small can turn into a nightmare. So yeah, if you're a parent, don't ignore your gut. And maybe take a closer look at what your kids bring home from school. You never know what kind of danger could be hiding in plain sight. It started innocently enough, as most unsettling things do. Our kitchen faucet had been leaking for weeks, and I finally mentioned it to Mr. Walters, our neighbor from 2 doors down. He was one of those overly helpful types, always tinkering in his garage, fixing things for the neighborhood. He'd helped us with minor repairs before, so when he offered to fix the faucet for free, I didn't think twice. He came over the next evening, toolbox in hand, and fixed it in under an hour. He was friendly, chatting about his woodworking hobby as he worked. I thanked him, and he smiled, saying, "I'll bring you something from the shop as a little gift." I thought it was odd. Shouldn't I be the one thanking him? But I shrugged it off. A few days later, he showed up with a cutting board. It was smooth, beautifully sanded, and had a rustic look. "Made it myself," he said proudly. I was impressed. We thanked him, and he waved it off like it was no big deal. At first, the board seemed perfect. I used it for chopping vegetables, bread, whatever. But one day, I noticed it had a weird smell. Not strong, just faint, but enough to make me curious. It reminded me of old pennies. I chalked it up to the wood finish, or maybe something I'd chopped on it. I scrubbed it thoroughly, but the smell lingered. Then came the dark spots. They were small, almost like tiny stains deep in the grain. I didn't notice them until I was slicing onions one night. I ran my knife over a crack, and something blackish red flaked out. My stomach turned. I thought maybe it was dried sauce or juice from a beet, but we hadn't cooked anything like that recently. I scraped at the spot with a knife. The material that came out was tacky, and the metallic smell was stronger. That's when it hit me. Blood. I told myself I was imagining things. Who would give someone a cutting board with blood on it? Still, the thought wouldn't leave my head. That night, I told my husband. He laughed it off, said I was overthinking. Maybe it's just the wood. Sometimes they treat it with weird stuff. I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I couldn't let it go. The next day, while my husband was at work, I decided to do some digging. I'd heard Mr. Walters talk about his woodworking shop before, and I figured he might have a website or something. I searched his name online but found nothing. That felt strange. A guy who talked about his hobby so much didn't even have an online presence? Something else came up, though. An old news article. It mentioned a man with the same name who'd been questioned in connection with a missing woman 2 years earlier. The article said he was released due to lack of evidence. My stomach dropped. I stared at the cutting board, sitting innocently on the counter. My imagination ran wild. What if it wasn't just random wood he used? What if it came from somewhere? Worse. I decided to take the board to the police. I felt ridiculous walking in, explaining my suspicions, but the officer at the desk took me seriously. They called me 2 days later. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few more questions," the detective said. My heart pounded as I drove to the station. When I got there, the detective wasted no time. "The wood from your cutting board matches fragments we found at a crime scene 2 years ago," he said. "The metallic smell you noticed? It's from human blood. We believe Mr. Walters used wood from the scene to make the board." I felt like I was going to throw up. The detective explained that the missing woman had been killed in a cabin, her body dismembered, and pieces of the structure had been removed. Walters had been a suspect back then, but denied knowing anything. I couldn't believe it. The friendly neighbor who fixed our faucet had essentially handed me evidence of a murder. Mr. Walters was arrested the next day. I watched from my window as the police let him out in cuffs. He didn't struggle or say a word, just stared blankly ahead. It's been months now, but I still think about that cutting board every time I step into the kitchen. I can't help but wonder if he gave others similar gifts. I try not to think about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed those dark spots. If you ever get a handmade gift from someone, check it carefully. You never know what they might be hiding. A few weeks ago, I came home from work to find a small, neatly wrapped box sitting on my doorstep. It wasn't my birthday or any special occasion, so I thought maybe it was a delivery mistake. But when I looked at the tag, it had my name written on it. Specifically, it said, "Mommy." At first I thought it was sweet. Maybe from my husband or a relative, something meant for our daughter, Ava. She's 3, and people love spoiling her. I brought the box inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and opened it while Ava toddled around in the living room. Inside was a plush bunny, soft and cute, with one of those built-in voice modules. It had a little pull tab sticking out of the side, the kind that starts the recording once you yank it. Ava spotted it right away and ran over, her face lighting up. "Bunny!" she squealed, grabbing it before I could stop her. I smiled but hesitated for a second. I hadn't ordered this, and neither had my husband. There wasn't a card inside or any indication of who sent it. Still, it looked harmless enough. I pulled the tab to hear what it said, expecting something generic like, "I love you" or "Happy birthday." Instead, a voice crackled to life, high-pitched and sweet, saying, "Mommy, I'm with him." It was my daughter's voice. My stomach dropped. Ava was staring at the bunny, oblivious, hugging it tightly. My hands started to shake as I grabbed it from her and replayed the message. It wasn't just a child's voice, it was hers. I tried to think logically. Maybe my husband had gotten it as a surprise. Maybe it was one of those custom recording toys you can find online. But the voice? It was too clear, too real. I hadn't recorded anything like that, and Ava couldn't. I suddenly remembered something that happened a few days ago at the playground. Ava had been running around while I sat on a bench, scrolling through my phone. At one point, I looked up and saw her near the fence, talking to someone on the other side. It was just a quick glance, and I hadn't thought much of it. Probably a passerby or another kid's parent. But now, the memory felt sharper. Wrong. I asked Ava, "Sweetheart, where did you get this bunny?" She pointed at the door. "The man gave it to me," she said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "What man?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice calm. She shrugged. "The man at the fence." My blood turned cold. I asked her more questions, but she didn't have much to say. She's only 3. Her answers were vague and jumbled. She just kept hugging the bunny. That night, I told my husband everything. He didn't take it seriously at first, thought it was some mix-up or prank. But when he heard the recording, he went silent. We decided to call the police. The officers who came were polite but not overly concerned. They took the bunny as evidence and asked a lot of questions. Had we seen anyone suspicious? Did we have cameras? Could Ava describe the person? We didn't have cameras, and Ava couldn't give much of a description beyond a man. They told us to keep an eye out and call if anything else happened. That was it. But things didn't feel over. I started noticing little things, like how Ava would sometimes talk to herself, or so I thought. Once I walked into her room and found her sitting by the window, staring out at the street. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Waiting for him to wave." I stopped letting her play outside alone. A week later, I was taking out the trash when I saw something shiny tucked under the bushes by our front door. It was a disposable camera. I didn't touch it. I called the police again, and they came to pick it up. They didn't tell us much, just that they'd look into it. That night, my husband stayed up late watching TV while I tried to sleep. Around midnight, I heard him yell. I ran downstairs to find him staring at his phone. Someone had sent him a text. It was a photo of Ava, taken through the living room window. She was sitting on the couch, holding that bunny. The message just said, "She likes her gift." We moved out of that house a week later. The police said they'd keep investigating, but we never heard anything else. I still don't know who sent that box or how they got Ava's voice. We've installed cameras at the new place, and I never let her out of my sight anymore. I just keep thinking about that message. I'm with him. Whoever him is, I pray we never find out. So, this happened on my birthday last year, and I still can't get it out of my head. It started off as a pretty normal day. I'm one of those people who doesn't like making a big deal about birthdays, but my coworkers insisted on throwing a little celebration during lunch. You know, cake, a few decorations, nothing crazy. One of my colleagues, Mark, handed me this big, colorful balloon tied up with a bunch of ribbons. He grinned and said, "There's a surprise inside. You'll love it." Everyone laughed, and I didn't think much of it, and I didn't. Mark's always been the goofy one in the office. Pranks, jokes, harmless stuff. Or so I thought. The balloon was huge, like the size of a beach ball. Mark made a big show about how I shouldn't pop it right away, but curiosity got the better of everyone. "Come on," someone said. "We want to see what's inside." So I grabbed a pair of scissors and went for it. The second the balloon popped, things got weird. Instead of confetti or candy, this gray metallic dust came pouring out. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It wasn't until my friend Laura, who was standing right next to me, screamed that I realized something was wrong. She clutched her arm, and I saw these thin, sharp cuts all over her skin. Blood started trickling down, and she looked pale. Then, another coworker, Greg, let out a yell and covered his eye. He was squinting, clearly in pain. That's when it hit me. The surprise inside the balloon wasn't just dust. It was tiny metal shavings. The whole room froze for a second. You know that silence when everyone's trying to process what just happened? Then, chaos broke out. Laura was sobbing, and someone grabbed tissues to press against her cuts. Greg sat down, groaning, his hand still over his eye. The rest of us stood there in shock, staring at the mess on the floor. The shavings glinted under the fluorescent lights, sharp and jagged. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I was to being the one hurt. If I'd been leaning in just a little further. Mark, though? He just stood there, watching. When I finally snapped out of it, I turned to him and shouted, "What the hell, Mark? What is this?" He looked startled, like he hadn't expected anyone to confront him. Then he gave this awkward laugh and said, "Oh, come on. It was just a joke. You know, like a prank." A prank? Who does that? Laura and Greg were rushed to urgent care. Thankfully, Laura's cuts were shallow, but Greg wasn't so lucky. A shard had scratched his cornea. He's okay now, but he had to take weeks off work, and he still talks about how bad the pain was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment the balloon burst, The look on Laura's face, the sound of Greg yelling, and Mark's excuse, just a joke, kept echoing in my head. Something about it didn't sit right. This wasn't some silly office prank. Someone could have been seriously hurt. The next morning, I called HR. They said they'd look into it. But honestly, I didn't trust them to do much. So, I went to the police. Reporting Mark wasn't easy. He'd been a coworker for years, and part of me felt guilty, like I was overreacting. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how intentional it all was. He'd filled that balloon with sharp metal pieces. He had to know how dangerous it was. The investigation uncovered more than I expected. Mark had a history of pranks that had gone too far. A couple of years ago, he'd put glue on someone's keyboard as a joke. Before that, he'd rigged a chair to collapse when someone sat on it. But this was on another level. Turns out, he'd been stockpiling the metal shavings from a hobby he had, making little sculptures out of scrap metal. He told the police he didn't mean to hurt anyone, but I'm not so sure. Who thinks it's okay to give someone a balloon full of sharp, dangerous fragments? Mark ended up losing his job and facing charges for reckless endangerment. He avoided jail time, but he's got a record now. I don't work at that office anymore. I left a few months after everything happened. Even now, when someone hands me a gift or suggests a surprise, I get this tight feeling in my chest. It's scary how quickly something innocent can turn dangerous. Mark might have thought he was being funny, but his actions changed the way I see people. You never really know what someone's capable of. So, yeah. If anyone ever gives you a balloon with a surprise inside, maybe think twice before popping it. I never thought a piece of exercise equipment could ruin my life. But here I am, typing this from a hospital bed, my legs in casts, and my mind racing. It started innocently enough. Well, as innocent as things can be when revenge is involved. A few weeks ago, I had a falling out with a close friend, Jake. We'd been tight for years, but lately things had been tense. Stupid stuff mostly. Money I forgot to pay him back for a dinner once. A girl he liked but thought I was flirting with. It all came to a head at a party when he flat out accused me of being a user. I called him dramatic. He called me selfish. And we stopped talking after that. Out of the blue last week, Jake showed up at my door. He had this huge grin on his face like nothing had happened. In his truck was a shiny, barely used home strength training machine. You know, one of those all-in-one setups with weights, pulleys, and bars. I got this a while back but never really used it, he said. Thought you might like it. A peace offering. I was skeptical. Who gives away something so expensive after a fight? But it looked solid, and he insisted. Consider it me making up for being a jerk, he said. Against my better judgment, I let it slide. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I set it up in my garage that weekend. The assembly wasn't bad, but some of the bolts were kind of loose out of the box. I tightened everything and gave it a test run. It seemed fine. I even texted Jake to thank him. See? Not such a bad guy after all, he replied. For the next few days, I used the machine every morning before work. It became a nice little routine. Some bench presses, a few pull-downs. I was starting to feel good, stronger. Then, on the fourth day, it happened. I was mid-rep on the leg press when I felt a jolt. Something shifted. I didn't even have time to process it before one of the weight stacks came crashing down. The bar I was pressing slipped, and the whole structure collapsed toward me. I don't remember much after that, just searing pain and me screaming for help. My neighbor, thank God, heard the noise and called 911. At the hospital, they told me I had multiple fractures in both legs. Recovery would take months, maybe longer. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could a brand new machine just fail like that? Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a mechanic from the shop I'd hired to haul the broken equipment away. Hey, he said, just wanted to let you know. Those bolts on the weight stack weren't just loose. They'd been tampered with. Someone deliberately unscrewed them. I felt my stomach drop. My first thought was Jake. But that was insane, right? Who does something like that? I tried to convince myself it was a manufacturing defect, or maybe I hadn't assembled it properly. But the mechanic was adamant. "No way this was an accident," he said. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Jake's sudden change of heart, the way he pushed the gift on me, his history of holding grudges. And then there was the text he sent after I thanked him. Not such a bad guy after all. I started digging. Turns out, Jake had told another mutual friend about his plan to teach me a lesson weeks before the accident. He didn't go into detail, but apparently he'd been fuming over the way I always took advantage of him. When I confronted him, he laughed. "What are you even talking about?" he said. But his voice cracked just enough to give him away. I went to the police. They took my statement, but proving intent in a case like this isn't easy. Jake claimed he had no idea what happened, that the machine must have been defective. I don't know if anything will come of it legally, but I know the truth. Now I'm stuck here, helpless and angry, replaying everything in my head. How did I miss the signs? Why didn't I listen to my gut when he showed up with that damn machine? If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you can't ignore red flags, no matter how small. People can surprise you in the worst ways. And sometimes, the ones you trust the most are the ones you should be most careful around. So yeah, next time someone offers you a gift out of the blue, maybe think twice. It might just save your life. It started out as such an innocent idea, just a sweet gesture from Grandpa. He'd been going on for weeks about how kids these days spend too much time on screens. So, when Christmas rolled around, he proudly unveiled his gift, a miniature climbing wall for the playroom. "Let them build their skills," he declared, beaming as if he'd just given them the world. Lisa, my 5-year-old, and her 8-year-old brother Jake were thrilled. We all were, honestly. It was colorful, sturdy looking, and came with foam mats to place underneath. Grandpa swore he followed the instructions in the kit to a T when he installed it himself. "I've got years of handyman experience," he'd said, waving off our offers to help. The first couple of days were pure joy. The kids spent hours climbing up and down, racing each other to the top. I'd sit in the corner with a cup of coffee, watching their smiles stretch from ear to ear. It felt good to see them being active and having fun without any screens involved. But by the third day, I noticed something strange. One of the bolts securing a handhold seemed slightly loose. It was barely perceptible, but it wiggled when I pressed on it. I made a mental note to tighten it later and went about my day, figuring it was just the wall settling in or something. That same afternoon, Lisa wanted to show me how she could climb all the way to the top by herself. She was so excited, her little face glowing with determination. "Watch me, Mommy," she called out, starting her ascent. Jake cheered her on from the sidelines. She was halfway up when it happened. A sharp snap broke the air, followed by the sickening sound of her scream. I turned in time to see her fall, arms flailing, the mat beneath her doing little to cushion the impact. I rushed to her, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Lisa was crying uncontrollably, clutching her legs. Jake froze, his face white as a sheet. I tried to stay calm, but the sight of her twisted legs made my stomach churn. One leg was bent in a way that no leg should ever bend. We called 911, and the paramedics arrived quickly. Lisa was still sobbing as they loaded her onto the stretcher, her small frame looking impossibly fragile. Jake kept asking, "Is she going to be okay?" Over and over, his voice breaking. I didn't have an answer for him. At the hospital, X-rays confirmed what I'd feared. Both of Lisa's legs were broken. One break was clean, but the other was complicated. A spiral fracture that the doctor warned might need surgery and months of physical therapy. "It's going to be a long road," he said, his tone serious. Grandpa showed up at the hospital later that evening. I could see the guilt on his face before he even spoke. "I didn't follow the instructions," he admitted, tears welling up in his eyes. He went on to explain that he'd skipped a few steps because the process seemed overly complicated. "I thought it would hold," he kept repeating, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to say to him. I wanted to scream, to blame him for what had happened. But looking at his crumpled expression, I couldn't bring myself to. He clearly hadn't meant for any of this to happen. but his carelessness had put my little girl in a hospital bed. Now, every day is a mix of appointments, therapy sessions, and endless worrying. Lisa's legs are in casts, and she's confined to a wheelchair for the foreseeable future. She's handling it better than I expected. She's a tough kid, but there are moments when she asks, "Why did this happen to me?" And I have no idea how to respond. The climbing wall has been dismantled and thrown away. Grandpa wanted to repair it, but I refused. The whole thing feels cursed now, like a monument to our failure to keep Lisa safe. Jake won't even go near the playroom anymore. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that shortcuts aren't worth the risk when it comes to safety. If Grandpa had just followed the instructions, Lisa wouldn't be facing months of recovery. It's a hard lesson, but one I hope others can learn from before it's too late. Hold your loved ones close, and if something seems even a little off, don't ignore it. It might save you from living through your own nightmare. It started innocently enough, like these things always do. My son Tim's 7th birthday had been a small affair, just a few friends, cake, and balloons. Late in the day, as we were cleaning up, our neighbor, Mr. Rogers, strolled over with a gift in hand. "Happy birthday, champ," he said, handing Tim a big, colorful construction set. The kind with interlocking pieces you can use to build towers, cars, or whatever a kid's imagination can conjure up. Tim's eyes lit up, and he immediately tore into the packaging. At first, I felt bad. We didn't have the best relationship with Mr. Rogers. Ever since we had a dispute about the fence between our yards, things had been tense. He'd mutter things under his breath when we passed each other, and sometimes he'd just stare, silent but with this look. I figured the gift was maybe an olive branch, his way of smoothing things over. But just 15 minutes later, Tim let out a scream. Not a startled yelp or an "oops, I tripped" kind of scream. It was blood-curdling. My heart dropped. I ran into the living room, and Tim was clutching his hand, his face twisted in pain. Blood trickled down his palm. On the carpet next to him were several pieces of the construction set, blocks and rods, scattered everywhere. I knelt beside him and took his hand. That's when I saw it. A thin, metallic needle sticking out of his finger. What the? I stopped myself. There wasn't just one needle. There were several, all embedded in the plastic pieces. I grabbed one of the blocks, and sure enough, the tip of another needle glinted in the light. It had been pushed into the plastic, almost flush with the surface, but sharp enough to poke out if you applied pressure. I felt sick. My hands started shaking as I gently pulled the needle from Tim's finger. I checked his other hand to make sure there weren't more injuries. My husband came rushing in, and his face turned pale when he saw the scene. We called Mr. Rogers right away. "What kind of sick joke is this?" I shouted as soon as he answered. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "The construction set. It's full of needles. Tim cut himself." There was a long pause. "I have no idea how that could have happened," he said finally, in that same tone that made my skin crawl. "I bought it at the store. Maybe you should take it up with them." But I knew better. The packaging hadn't been sealed. It was taped shut, like it had already been opened. Mr. Rogers had plenty of time to tamper with it before bringing it over. I told him we'd be calling the police, and he chuckled. "Good luck with that," he said before hanging up. The cops showed up about an hour later. They took the construction set and the needles for evidence, but it didn't feel like they were taking it seriously. One of the officers even muttered something about how paranoid parents could get over accidents. They questioned Mr. Rogers, but of course, he denied everything. There was no proof that he'd tampered with the set, and the manufacturer couldn't confirm where or how the needles had ended up in the toy. The case was dropped within a week. After that, we avoided Mr. Rogers at all costs. I stopped letting Tim play in the backyard unless I was out there with him. Every time I saw Mr. Rogers mowing his lawn or sitting on his porch, I felt a chill run down my spine. He'd wave sometimes, this slow, mocking wave, and I'd quickly look away. I thought things might get better with time, but I was wrong. A few weeks after the incident, I found our cat dead on the porch. No blood, no wounds, just dead, like it had been poisoned. We didn't have proof it was him, but deep down, I knew. My husband wanted to move, but we couldn't afford it. So we lived with the constant tension, always on edge, always looking over our shoulders. Tim didn't touch toys for months after that. He'd flinch at the sight of anything that resembled that construction set. Even now, years later, he still has a scar on his finger, a tiny, permanent reminder of that day. I guess the lesson here is, you can never really know what someone's capable of, even if they seem harmless. Mr. Rogers was just a quiet, retired guy next door, but he turned our lives into a nightmare. So yeah, if you ever get an unexpected gift, especially from someone you don't trust, maybe think twice before opening it. I always loved crafting. Sewing was my thing, and everyone in my family knew it. So when my Aunt Mary showed up for my birthday with an antique sewing machine, I was thrilled. It was one of those old cast-iron beasts with ornate gold detailing. The thing looked like it belonged in a museum. "This was my mother's," Aunt Mary said, patting it like it was an old friend. She swore by it, said it never let her down. I was blown away by the gift. It felt so personal. That night, I set it up in my little crafting corner, already imagining all the projects I'd take on with this relic. At first, everything seemed fine. I gave it a quick clean, threaded the needle, and tested it on a scrap of fabric. It worked like a dream, though it was loud and a bit jerky. But that added to the charm. It made me feel connected to its history, like I was keeping something alive. Then came the first real project, a simple hem job on an old pair of jeans. I sat down, pressed the foot pedal, and let the machine do its thing. The needle punched up and down with hypnotic precision, and I got into the rhythm. That's when it happened. My finger slipped under the needle. Just a fraction of a second of inattention, and the needle slammed right through the tip of my index finger. At first, I didn't even feel it. Shock, maybe. But then the pain hit. A white-hot, searing pain that made my vision blur. I screamed, yanked my hand back instinctively, but the machine didn't stop. The needle dragged my skin along with it, pulling deeper into the mechanism. I panicked, slamming my other hand onto the machine, trying to shut it off, but the stupid pedal was stuck. I don't even know how, but I managed to rip my finger free. Blood was everywhere, on the machine, the fabric, the floor. I wrapped my hand in a kitchen towel and sat there, trembling. It wasn't just the pain. It was something deeper, something wrong about the whole thing. The machine had felt alive. Not in a supernatural way, but like it was fighting me. At the hospital, the doctor cleaned the wound and gave me a tetanus shot. I ended up needing stitches and had to keep my hand wrapped for weeks. The scar is still there, an angry, jagged reminder. I called Aunt Mary later, partly for comfort, partly because I wanted to tell her what had happened. I thought she'd be horrified. Instead, she sighed. "Yeah," she said. "That machine's got a tricky pedal. You have to keep an eye on it." "Wait, you knew?" I snapped. "Oh, it's fine if you're careful," she said dismissively. "I just figured you'd notice. Besides, it's not the machine's fault." I hung up on her, stunned. She knew. She knew it was dangerous, and she gave it to me anyway. But here's where it gets worse. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through an online crafting forum looking for advice on fixing antique sewing machines. That's when I stumbled onto a thread about injuries. Someone mentioned a machine just like mine, a vintage model from the same manufacturer. Apparently, there was a defect in the mechanism. If the pedal jammed, the machine wouldn't stop until you cut the power entirely. Several people had been hurt, some even worse than me. One person said their grandmother had lost the tip of a finger. Another said their mom had nearly bled out when the needle punctured a vein. The company went out of business decades ago, likely because of the accidents. I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I called Aunt Mary again, pressing her for more details. She finally admitted that she'd heard about the defect, but didn't think it was a big deal. She just wasn't careful, Aunt Mary said, talking about her own mother. But I thought you'd appreciate the history. History. That's what mattered to her. Not the fact that this machine was practically a death trap. I don't use it anymore. It's boxed up in the garage, collecting dust. Every time I see it, I feel sick. Not just because of the scar or the memory of the pain, but because I trusted her. It's scary, you know? How easily someone can dismiss something dangerous. How they can hand you something that might ruin your life and call it a gift. I guess the lesson here is simple. Don't trust anything, or anyone, without looking closer. Just because something looks beautiful doesn't mean it's safe. I'll never forget the jar of jam. It's burned into my memory now, more than anything else from that week. It started so innocently, a simple dinner with my friend Sarah, something we'd done a dozen times before. She's one of those people who prides herself on her kitchen skills, always experimenting with recipes, and she showed up with this jar of homemade jam. "Family recipe?" she said with a big smile as she handed it to me. The jar was wrapped in a little ribbon even. "You've got to try this tonight. It's the best thing I've ever made." Dinner went great. We laughed, talked about work and family, and caught up on the little stuff. We had the jam with dessert, a dollop over some vanilla ice cream. It was delicious too, with this tangy sweet flavor that I couldn't place. We even joked about her finally opening her own little food business. Sarah left after dinner, and I didn't think much about the jam again until 2 days later. That's when the stomach pain started. At first I thought it was food poisoning, you know, bad takeout or something like that. But the pain kept getting worse, sharp, twisting cramps that felt like someone was wringing my insides out. My husband, Jake, started feeling it too. By the time we hit the 24-hour mark, we could barely stand. Jake was pale, sweating buckets, and kept saying his legs felt numb. We decided to go to the hospital. At the ER, everything moved in fast forward. They hooked us up to IVs, drew blood, and ran what felt like 100 tests. The doctor came in looking grim. "We think it's botulinum poisoning," he said. I didn't even know what that was, but the way he said it made my chest tighten. He explained it was a rare and dangerous kind of food poisoning caused by bacteria in improperly canned or preserved food. I froze. My mind immediately went to Sarah's jam. The doctor started asking questions, what we'd eaten, where it came from. I called Sarah right then, from the hospital bed. She sounded confused at first, but then said, "Oh my God, it couldn't be the jam, could it? I made it myself." She promised to check her recipe and ingredients. Hours went by. Jake was getting worse. His breathing was shallow, his speech slurred, and he started complaining about his vision. "Everything's blurry," he kept saying, panicked. I've never felt so helpless, sitting there watching him fall apart while the doctors rushed around us. The next day, Sarah called back in tears. "I think I messed up," she said. She explained she'd used some old jars her mom gave her but didn't sanitize them properly. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she kept saying. "I've done it before, and nothing happened." It was too late by then. The toxin had already done its damage. Jake lost vision in one eye entirely, something about nerve damage caused by the toxin. I was lucky. I recovered physically after a few days in the hospital, but I haven't stopped replaying everything in my head since. Sarah was devastated. She kept apologizing, swearing she'd never meant for this to happen. And I believe her. I do. But that doesn't change what happened. Jake's life is forever altered. Our lives are forever altered. We filed a report with the health department, and they took samples from the jam and the jars Sarah used. It was confirmed. Botulism spores in the improperly sterilized jars. I couldn't even bring myself to tell Sarah what the doctor said when we asked about Jake's eyesight. This kind of damage is irreversible. I still see Sarah sometimes, but it's strained. Every time I look at her, I think about that jar of jam and the days that followed. How something so small, so innocent, could turn into a nightmare. I've learned a lot since then about food safety. More than I ever wanted to know, really. I wouldn't wish this experience on my worst enemy. If you're making anything homemade, please, make sure you do it right. A tiny mistake can destroy someone's life. I've stopped eating anything homemade unless I make it myself now. And every time I walk through the jam aisle at the grocery store, I get this sick feeling in my stomach all over again. I never thought a simple birthday gift could almost end my life. It started at work, like any other day. I was wrapping up my shift when Daniel, a colleague from the accounting team, stopped by my desk. We weren't close friends or anything, but we shared the occasional joke in meetings. So, when he handed me a gift bag with a grin and said, "Happy early birthday, man," I didn't think much of it. Inside was a fancy coffee set, ceramic cups, a sleek grinder, and a small bag of artisanal beans. "Figured you'd like it," he said casually, nodding toward the coffee mug that was basically glued to my hand every morning. It was thoughtful, I guess, but a little unexpected. We'd had a minor argument a few weeks back over some work issue, but it wasn't serious. Just office politics. I thanked him, and he waved it off with a laugh. "Enjoy. Best coffee you'll ever have." The set sat on my kitchen counter for a couple of days before I got around to trying it. That Saturday, I woke up groggy and decided to finally break it out. The grinder worked smoothly, and the beans smelled amazing, rich and earthy. I brewed a cup and took a long sip, savoring the bold flavor. It was good coffee, but halfway through the cup, I started feeling off. At first, it was just a slight headache, which I brushed off as dehydration. Then, the nausea hit, sharp and relentless. My vision blurred, and my hands started shaking so badly I dropped the mug. By the time I made it to the bathroom, my legs felt like jelly. I spent the next hour hunched over the toilet, cold sweat dripping down my face. When I finally crawled back to bed, my chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting on it. The symptoms didn't go away. By Sunday afternoon, I was too weak to stand for more than a few minutes. My roommate convinced me to go to the ER. The doctors ran tests and gave me fluids, but they looked baffled. Then the blood work came back, and their expressions changed. "We found elevated levels of mercury in your system," one of them said, her tone serious. Mercury. The word didn't even register at first. "How the hell would I have mercury in my body?" I asked, my voice cracking. She asked about my recent activities, food, water, anything unusual. The only thing I could think of was the coffee. I mentioned it, and she paused, her brows furrowing. "Bring it in," she said. I took the grinder and beans to a lab for testing. The results came back within days. Traces of mercury had been detected in both. The beans themselves were fine. It was the grinder that was contaminated. I felt like I was in a bad crime show. Who would even do something like this? My mind kept going back to Daniel. That stupid grin on his face when he handed me the gift bag. But no, that was insane. Right? HR got involved after I reported it. They called Daniel in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. But when they mentioned the lab results, his story started falling apart. Turns out, it wasn't some elaborate murder plot, just a twisted, disgusting prank. He admitted to smearing mercury from a broken thermometer inside the grinder before wrapping it up. Why? Because of that petty argument we had weeks earlier. "I didn't think it'd actually hurt him," he said. I couldn't believe it. Who does that? How do you look at someone you work with every day and decide to poison them for a laugh? Daniel was fired on the spot, and I pressed charges. The legal process dragged on for months, but he eventually pled guilty to reckless endangerment. The physical effects didn't go away overnight, though. For weeks, I felt weak and foggy. I had to take time off work and see a specialist to monitor my recovery. Every time I smelled coffee, my stomach turned. I still don't drink it anymore. People asked me if I thought Daniel really meant to kill me. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe he didn't think it through. Maybe he didn't care. Either way, I came dangerously close to being another cautionary tale. So, yeah. Be careful who you trust. Even something as simple as a cup of coffee can carry more than caffeine. My brother, John, and I had been on bad terms for weeks. It started as a stupid argument, something about money, or who owed who what. Honestly, I can't even remember now. What stuck with me was the way it escalated. the tension stretching between us until I figured we might never talk again. So, when he showed up at my door a week later, holding a gift, I was surprised. He handed me a box. Inside was a sleek, expensive-looking kitchen knife. The handle was smooth, and the blade was polished to a mirror finish. "A peace offering," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It felt weird. A knife as a gift? Who does that? But I didn't want to prolong the fight, so I thanked him and set it on my kitchen counter. Over the next few days, I'd catch myself looking at it, unease settling in my stomach. The knife was beautiful, sure, but something about the whole situation felt off. A month passed. Things between John and me smoothed out, sort of. He started dropping by more often, usually unannounced. He'd talk about random things, like the neighbors who always had it out for him, or the new job he hated. I noticed he'd glance at the knife every time he came over, even if we were talking about something completely unrelated. One day, while he was over, I was chopping vegetables, and he pointed at the knife. "Sharp, isn't it?" he said. Then he grinned. Good choice for protection, if anything. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I laughed it off, pretending not to notice how his tone felt heavier than the words. I put the knife away in the drawer after that. A week later, everything went sideways. It was around 10 p.m., and I was getting ready for bed when I heard shouting from outside. My apartment building isn't in the best area, so random arguments on the street aren't uncommon. But this wasn't random. It was John. I recognized his voice, loud and aggressive. I peeked through the blinds and saw him in a full-blown shouting match with the couple who lived across the hall from me. I opened the door and tried to call out to him, to tell him to cool it, but he didn't even hear me, or maybe he ignored me. I couldn't tell. The next thing I knew, he stormed into my apartment, slamming the door behind him. "They're trying to screw me over," he yelled, pacing my tiny living room. "John, what the hell are you talking about?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he went straight to my kitchen. My heart sank as I realized what he was looking for. "Don't!" I started, but it was too late. He grabbed the knife, the peace offering, the one I'd shoved in the drawer and forgotten about. "John, stop. Just leave it alone," I said, my voice shaky. But he wasn't listening. He pushed past me and went back out into the hall. I followed, my stomach in knots, trying to reason with him. But it was like talking to a brick wall. The argument with the neighbors flared up again, more heated this time. I stood frozen, watching as John's grip on the knife tightened. And then it happened. It was quick. A flash of steel. A scream. Blood. So much blood. I don't even remember how it ended. The neighbors' faces were a blur of fear and pain. John ran, and I just stood there, useless. Someone must have called the police because the next thing I knew, I was being questioned, cuffed, and stuffed into the back of a patrol car. Apparently the knife was registered to me, a little detail I hadn't even thought about when I accepted it as a gift. That made me look complicit, like I'd been part of the plan. I spent hours in interrogation, explaining over and over that I had no idea what John was planning, that I never wanted anything to happen. In the end, they believed me, mostly. But the damage was done. John disappeared after that night. I haven't seen him since, but every now and then, I get a call from someone asking questions about him. He's out there somewhere, and I don't think he'll ever turn himself in. I still think about that knife, about how something so small, so seemingly harmless, could turn into a tool of destruction. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut when he first gave it to me. Something about it was always wrong. If you ever feel that kind of unease, don't ignore it. Listen to it. You never know what small thing could spiral into something bigger, something you can't take back. It all started with what was supposed to be the perfect Christmas gift. Grandpa decided to surprise the kids with a massive trampoline. You know the kind, huge, with a bouncy mat and a safety net. He set it up in the backyard on Christmas Eve, grinning like a kid himself. And when the kids saw it on Christmas morning, they went nuts. Jason, my little nephew, was the most excited. He had just turned 5 and had boundless energy. Watching him bounce around was like watching pure joy. For the first few days, it was great. The kids spent hours out there, laughing, screaming, doing flips. Well, the older ones did flips. Jason mostly just bounced around, his face lit up with pure happiness. We took videos and shared them with friends, commenting on how much fun they were having. It felt like the perfect holiday memory in the making. But then, by the 4th day, something felt off. It was subtle at first. The safety net around the trampoline seemed to sag a little in one corner. I pointed it out to Grandpa, but he waved it off, saying he'd tighten it later. "It's just settling," he said. I wanted to believe him. He'd spent a lot of money on that thing, and the box made it look like the safest trampoline you could buy. The kids were careful, well, as careful as kids could be, and the net was supposed to be their safety buffer. That morning, the kids ran out to play as usual. I was inside, cleaning up after breakfast when I heard it, a scream that pierced through the air like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was Jason. I dropped what I was doing and ran outside, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Jason was on the ground next to the trampoline, lying awkwardly on the stone curb that bordered the yard. His face was pale, his mouth wide open in a silent cry, and his little arm was bent at an angle that didn't look right. The safety net had torn. Not just torn, a whole section of it had given way, like it had been held together by threads instead of sturdy stitching. Jason must have been bouncing near the edge when it ripped, and he flew right out. The trampoline was set up too close to the yard's edge, so there wasn't any soft grass to break his fall, just that unforgiving curb. I shouted for help, my voice cracking as I tried to keep calm. My sister, Jason's mom, came running out, and the look on her face was something I'll never forget. We called 911 while Grandpa stood there, frozen, his hands shaking. "It's my fault," he kept saying under his breath. "I should have checked it." The ambulance arrived quickly, but those minutes felt like hours. Jason was crying by then, his face flushed and tears streaming down his cheeks. I tried to comfort him, but I was shaking too badly to hold him steady. The paramedics got him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital, leaving us standing there in a stunned silence. At the hospital, the x-rays confirmed it. Jason's arm was broken, a clean fracture but still serious. The doctors were kind, reassuring us that he'd heal just fine with time, but that didn't make it easier. Seeing Jason in that little hospital bed, his arm in a cast, was gut-wrenching. Grandpa was inconsolable. He couldn't stop blaming himself. We all tried to comfort him, telling him it wasn't his fault. But deep down, I knew we'd all noticed something was wrong with that net. Later, we checked the trampoline again, and what we found made my stomach turn. The stitching on the net wasn't just defective. It looked rushed, uneven, like it had been done in a hurry. Grandpa found the manual and discovered a tiny, almost hidden note about potential stitching defects. No bold warning, no mention on the box, just a small line buried in the instructions. We reached out to the manufacturer, furious. They offered an apology and said they'd issue a recall for similar models, but that didn't feel like enough. What if Jason had hit his head instead of his arm? What if it had been worse? Since then, I can't look at trampolines the same way. That gift, meant to bring joy, almost ended in tragedy. It was a harsh reminder that safety should never be assumed, especially when it comes to kids. To anyone reading this, please, if you have a trampoline or any toy that could potentially be dangerous, double-check it, triple-check it, and don't ignore those little nagging doubts. It only takes a second for something fun to turn into a nightmare. I've thought a lot about whether or not to share this story. It still makes me shiver when I think about how close I came to something much worse. But maybe someone out there can learn from what happened. It started about 6 months ago when we noticed a few shingles missing from our roof after a bad storm. My wife and I agreed we'd try to fix it ourselves to save some cash. I mentioned it to our neighbor Bob, who always seemed eager to help with projects around the neighborhood. Bob's the kind of guy who's always hanging out in his yard, waving at everyone who walks by, quick to offer advice, even when no one's asking for it. A couple of days later, he showed up at our doorstep, holding a shiny new folding ladder. "Thought you might need this," he said, grinning ear to ear. "Your old ladder looks pretty sketchy. This one's way safer." I thanked him and assured him we had it under control, but he kept insisting. "Trust me, you'll feel a lot better using this. Those old ones can be death traps." His persistence was a little weird, but Bob's always been a bit overbearing. I figured he was just trying to be nice. The ladder did look sturdy, and I was grateful not to have to climb the rickety one we'd been using. I leaned it against the house and got to work the next day. The first few climbs went fine. I carried up some tools, measured the damaged area, and started replacing the shingles. Bob watched from his yard, giving me a thumbs up every time I glanced his way. It felt a little odd having an audience, but I brushed it off. On the fourth climb, I grabbed a bag of tools and stepped onto the ladder. As I reached the third rung, I heard a sharp click, like metal snapping into place. Before I could process the sound, the ladder buckled beneath me. I didn't even have time to yell. 1 second I was climbing. The next, I was on the ground, gasping for air. The fall felt like it took an eternity, but the landing was sudden and brutal. Pain shot through my back like I'd been struck by lightning. My wife ran out, panicking, and called an ambulance. Bob rushed over, wide-eyed, mumbling about how he couldn't believe the ladder had failed. I remember him hovering, wringing his hands like he was the one who'd fallen. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed I had a spinal fracture. I was lucky not to be paralyzed, but I'd be out of commission for weeks. My wife mentioned the ladder to the paramedics, who took it with them, just in case. That's where things got strange. The fire department tested the ladder to figure out what went wrong. When the report came back, they found that one of the locks, the mechanism that keeps the ladder from folding while in use, had been filed down. It was deliberate. Someone had tampered with it. When we told Bob what the fire department had found, his demeanor shifted. He didn't act surprised. He just kind of shrugged and avoided eye contact. "Well, I might have adjusted it a little," he admitted after some prodding. "Why the hell would you do that?" my wife snapped. "Bob's excuse? I thought it might make you more careful. I didn't want you getting too comfortable up there and doing something reckless." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He looked genuinely confused when I told him how dangerous that was. "But you're okay," he said. Like that somehow made it better. The police got involved, but Bob insisted he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. He claimed he was just helping in his own misguided way. The ladder wasn't sabotaged enough to warrant serious charges, and since I hadn't died or been permanently injured, it didn't escalate further. Still, the trust was gone. Bob apologized half-heartedly a few times, but I stopped talking to him altogether. Every time I saw him after that, I felt a wave of anger, and something deeper, like fear. What if I hadn't been so lucky? What if my wife had used the ladder instead? The whole thing has left me paranoid. I triple-check everything now. Tools, appliances, even gifts from people I know. It's a horrible feeling, realizing how quickly something harmless can turn into a life-or-death situation. So, if someone ever insists on helping you with something, even if they seem well-meaning, double-check everything. Some mistakes aren't accidents, and some helpful neighbors are anything but.